Welcome everybody. I think everyone's in the vestibule. Anyone still in the vestibule? Thank you so much for joining us today. Wonderful to have you all here on behalf of the AIA Westchester Hudson Valley chapter and other sponsors. My name is J.C. Calderon, local beacon architect, Calderon Architecture, current president of the local chapter of the AIA in Westchester Hudson Valley, and we're really happy to have you here today to join us. Just wanted to get some quick housekeeping notes in order to get everyone up to speed, and then I'll introduce the speakers. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who made this event possible. All the AIA board members from our chapter are here. Just raise your hands. Steve Tilley, James Hartford, John Megenschein, and Allison Spear will be here soon. And I'd like to thank Hector Munoz-Barras, who also helped, but couldn't make it today due to a medical procedure, but he helped as well. I'd also like to thank the organizations that helped make this possible. Over Creek Farm, Homes Fund Foods, Dia Beacon, the Craig House, the Dutch Reformed Church of Beacon, the Howland Cultural Library, and the Beacon Historical Society. For those of you who are architects and scheduled to get learning credits, you need to attend the entire event. To do that, it's an all or nothing deal. So when you go to each event, make sure that James Hartford knows that you are attending, please, so he can check your name off if you're an architect getting credits. Regarding transportation between events, if you need help, let me or Teresa Kraft, who's the president of the Howland, is she here? Or Teresa's in the back. So just ask for Teresa or myself, and we'll try to help with the transportation between events if you don't have. We're not providing transportation. The idea is that every event ends about 10 to the hour. You have 10 minutes to get to the next location, which is about 5 minutes in the car. The other thing I wanted to promote or make note of, if you are staying in the Hudson Valley for the weekend, there's lots of things to do in Beacon. The Beacon Historical Society today from 1 to 3 is open. They wanted me to let you know that we have a wonderful exhibit between 1 and 3. We're taking lunch between 1 and 2, so you may want to go there. T-Space in Rhinebeck has also been a location that we're looking at doing an event in Rhinebeck, and they're open tomorrow from 1 to 5, I believe, tomorrow. And you can maybe go there if you want, 11 to 5 tomorrow. And T-Space is a wonderful art and architectural lab in Rhinebeck, done by Stephen Hall Architects. A few years ago, I've been in Beacon about 11 years, it occurred to me that the AIA, which is a national organization with many local chapters, really should do something here in Beacon at the Howland, because the architect of this building was one of the founders, one of the 10 founders of the AIA national organization. And Richard Morrison went on to do many projects, as you'll learn today, of historical nature, and we're very proud to have one of his early projects here in Beacon. So it occurred to me that we should do something. I mentioned this to Craig Wolf, the former president of the Howland, and he agreed that, well, at the time we weren't sure what would happen. Then earlier this year, I mentioned that to Craig in a newsletter that I think it was going to be an AIA event, and he said, hey, let's do the celebration of the 150th. So here we are. I'm glad that the AIA and its members have an opportunity to come here to get to know one of Richard Morrison's projects. And today's presenters will include a young and growing architecture historian, Stephen Balsas, from the area, who will teach you all about this building, as well as the next two buildings that we'll be visiting, which I'll mention in a second. And then our esteemed architect guest, James Rose, who will be speaking, former partner of Byron Leader Bell, with many important projects in his belt, among which include the restoration of the Grand Central Terminal for the 100th anniversary, and he'll an important player in that restoration. He's here to join us to talk about many things. And of course, the young Jeff Wilkinson is here today, and he's our architect for the building here and its restoration many years ago, as well as its future repairs that the Howland is seeking funds for. So if you know anyone who has some money to help Howland, please let Jeff Wilkinson. I'll wrap it up in a second, but every time I do go to Grand Central Terminal, I remind myself of my good friend Jim Rose, and his work. But I also remind myself of Vincent Scully's wonderful quote, the historian Vincent Scully's wonderful quote about the new and the old Penn Station in New York City after it was demolished, and what a colossal mistake that demolition was. And he famously stated that with the old Penn Station, one entered the city like a god, one scuttles in now like a rat. So it's always a good, I think, dichotomy for me to sort of consider when we talk about buildings and cities and how we enter them and how we don't. Today's tours will include this building just before 1 p.m. hopefully, the Howland Cultural Center, which was the Beacon Howland Library up until I think 1972 or so, right, 1976. And now it's a cultural center, so we'll have a brief tour of Jeff Wilkinson and others from Howland. Following that at 2, we'll have the Crank House, also known as Tiranga, which was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Howland, who built this building. And Mr. Hunt also worked with that building alongside with the main architect, Frederick Withers. And we'll have a tour with Stephen Baltzis on that. And then following that at 3, the Dutch Reformed Church of Beacon, which again, the addresses are online, but you can find that again with help. It's all very close to us. That's closer to the DOM, we'll terminate at 4. So the Dutch Reform will be from 3 to 4, and then the other will be at 4 to 4:50 or so, and they're going to give us a tour of their building. And so what do all these buildings have in common? I would argue that they all, in a sense, make you feel like a god when you enter, right? And not like a rat. And so I would argue that as architects and promoters of architecture and people, we should all advocate that all our buildings make you feel like a god when you enter, and not a rat. So with that, I will give it to our first speaker, Stephen Baltzis. Please welcome. Please join us.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, JC, for the introduction. And really going off of what you said about the demolition of Penn Station, the style of this building, the style of some of the other buildings we'll be visiting today is called High Victorian Gothic. That is from scholars and has come down to us really in the past 50, 60, 70 years. But there are some issues with the term which we'll explore today. And High Victorian Gothic, sort of as an umbrella term, has two sides, which we'll see, and they were introduced to this country in Beacon. So we really have really a rich architectural heritage here that any city should be envious of. So High Victorian Gothic, the two sides that are represented in this building, as we'll see, and Hunt's other work for the Howlands in the early 1870s. And they are some of his early works done in this style, and all of the other works really in this country that Hunt designed in this style really no longer exist. A lot of them were in Newport, one was in Yale, and they've been demolished because the style in the mid-20th century was really despised. And I'll sort of talk about that more on the tours too. But I want to appreciate just my appreciation for everyone for showing up for this really pivotal period in American history and architecture, the mid-19th century. It was a cultural crossroads. It was a chaotic time throughout the world. But the style really represents that. It has this energy to it, and it is very multicultural. But let's begin at the beginning of this period. That's weird. Okay, here we go. So 170 years ago this summer, Andrew Jackson Downing, spokesman of the American Gothic Revival, drowned in a steamboat accident on Hudson. Of all the achieving more success in his career as an active designer, Downing had been the leading voice in American architectural and horticultural literature since his works on landscape gardening and domestic planning in the early 1840s were purchased by the thousands. A native of Newburgh, Downing's interest in the Gothic Revival emerged in the 1830s, when examples of this English-bred style had begun to appear on the east shore of the Hudson. In its youth, Gothic had been taken verbatim, and the new castles being built along the Hudson led many to associate the Hudson Valley with England, a long-standing association, the Scottish Highlands with its baronial manners, or the German Rhine with its rugged strongholds. That's frustrating. We were so excited about this laser pointer, and now it's sort of disappointing me.
You need contact with the computer, and I think that.
Oh, the computer does.
With the computer. That would be.
Wow.
So Alexander Jackson Davis, Downing's companion and the figure behind most of his published designs, was an early castle builder on Hudson. And one of his first was planted here at Beacon, half of it then the village of Fishkill Landing. And this house was planned for Southern banker Robert Donaldson. Resembles Lyndhurst, the early iteration of which is here. The villa was not built, but Gothic designers from this point forward would begin to justify their castles with claiming that the spirit of place here in the Hudson Valley was very European, and so they associated the landscape of the Hudson Highlands with Europe, where castles existed. So one figure who detested such castles was English immigrant architect Calvert Vaux, who Downing had met in London in the summer of 1850 and hired as a partner in the firm Downing and Vaux. Left as a solo architect after his death, one of Vaux's first clients was Downing's friend, the horticulturist and landscape gardener Henry Winthrop Sargent. Sargent requested an addition to his house in Fishkill Landing, and he purchased the main house there at his estate called Wodenhead in 1841. It was built in the late 1830s and completed about 1840. This was ironically the same land that Robert Donaldson aimed to build his Gothic villa on. Between 1847 and 49, Sargent traveled with his family through Europe and around the Mediterranean, writing to Downing of the gardens that he saw there. In a letter dated the 21st of May, 1848, Sargent can't seem to stop himself from comparing the terraced landscape of Lake Como, Italy, to the Hudson Highlands, saying, "Every point you turn, you come to a villa, snugly stowed away on a projecting cliff like West Point, as if to be put out of temptation. The mountain begins from the water. That is the character of all Italian lakes." So I've compared Lake Como in the 1840s, as Sargent would have seen it, with the Hudson Highlands, and you see sort of where he was coming from. The mountain begins from the water. So Vaux was fully informed with his planning. Oh, okay. And Vaux, based on Sargent's opinion of Italy and the Hudson Highlands, added this dramatic Italian force to reconcile the lush lawns, mountainous view shed of Wodenhead with the existing Greek Revival house, a style Downing urged was inappropriate for its natural placement. Vaux's addition was a 3-story Italian tower with a new dining room, sitting room, bedrooms above, and a kitchen wing. Sargent and Vaux have provided a crucial break in the existing design management of the Hudson Highlands, broadening wider its possible geographic points of reference to northern Italy with Sargent's experience at Lake Como. By the beginning of 1854, Vaux had formally partnered with Frederick Clark Withers, an office assistant and draftsman born in England that Downing hired from London in February 1852. In the spring of 1856, Vaux exited the firm Vaux and Withers and left Newburgh with his family to practice in New York City and also design Central Park. Limited by Vaux's command, it is only after spring 1856 that we begin to see Withers' personal style surface, albeit heavily based on principles and theory from the Downing Vaux office. Withers' first clients had purchased land in Bonneville, the riverbound edge of the town of Newburgh, popular for estates since the 1830s. In Glenbrook, a Gothic villa designed for horticulture stayed at Clarkson in 1856 and built the next summer, Withers specified the brick not be painted, going against the routine finish for brick buildings in the Northeast at this time. He preferred that the bricks be left to the elements to change their hue over time, and if the owner would let ivy cling to the sides of the house, nothing can be more charming than the contrast. Soft tints of red with delicate greens and browns, time and the beautifier will do the rest. In this statement, as well as in some engineering factors throughout the house, Withers for the first time breaks away from the design standards of Downing and Vaux. Even a year before Glenbrook was planned, the building specifications of Vaux and Withers requested that all of their houses be painted. In England, the aftermath of art critic John Ruskin's The Seven Lamps of Architecture of 1849 and The Stones of Venice, published between 1851 and 53, had launched the trend of Ruskinism, a grouping of aesthetics associated with Ruskin and his works. Although enthusiastically deviant from the standard Gothic revival trends at the time, architects following Ruskin made their own judgments about his writings and conclusions, so that Ruskinism had gone beyond Ruskin's control. At the core of Ruskinism was the faith in the unique Gothic architecture of Italy, rather than the prevailing Gothic of Northern Europe, France, Germany, or England, which he admired but believed was outdone, only suited for the climate of those countries and aggressive in its vertical agenda. Italian Gothic was understood as being easily suitable for any environment, having more pose and being horizontal. This was conveyed by continuous lines or rows of arches across buildings, emphasizing their broad yet compact posture. I show these Ruskinian Gothic buildings of the 1850s, and also their sort of medieval Italian counterparts. We see all the arcades here in the Duomo of Ferrara, and in the Siena Duomo, these lines of stone, and also at Edmonton Park. In medieval Italy, colored building materials and inlaying were used extensively, unlike the applied paint and polychromy of Roman Gothic. This materialized literally in the 1850s, and Ruskinian architects experimented with structural polychromy in their buildings, integrating imported marbles, technicolor brick, and brick molded in mimicry of Venetian and Florentine door casings. Ruskin preferred the use of pure stone to be carved and cut by craftsmen as in the medieval period, and brick became the standard British building material of the 1850s after Queen Victoria abolished the brick tax in 1850. Through his brother Robert Jewel Withers, who was an architect practicing in England at this time, here in Newburgh, Withers, through his correspondence, heard of these developments back home and fully embraced them in his own practice. This new fashion, aptly termed today Ruskinian Gothic, is the first phase of High Victorian Gothic that Withers introduced to America. I will call this the Ruskinian school of High Victorian Gothic going forward, the less obscure one, and introduce the second school later on. In Morningside, a villa Withers designed in 1859 for retired Brooklyn banker Frederick Deming in Bonneville, we see these trends from England coming to America. And this, by all accounts, is the first High Victorian Gothic house in North America, the Ruskinian School. The house still stands, and you can visit the library today in the American Wing. To see the influence of Italy on the exterior, we look above the windows and notice the sequence of sandstone and brick structures, creating a bichromatic banding taken from illustrations of 13th century by floor windows and archways from the beginning architect George Evans Street's 1855 book, Brick and Marble in the Middle Ages. So I'm pointing out the structures here on Morningside and the Stormer, and also the blocks in between, creating this rhythm, and they're taken from Street's book that Withers purchased, probably through his brother. The traditional Northern Italian Gothic coloring introduces this natural contrast, which is amplified by the material of the house, a blood red pressed Philadelphia brick, with light sandstone points at the house's edges. Add to this also green and purple Vermont slate, green vines, and shadows produced by the Gothic barnboards. Everywhere Withers is painting with color, intensity, violence, length, cutting and pulling apart forms to create this house. In June 1859, when Morningside is planned and ready for construction, Withers had finished the building specifications for one of his most unusual buildings that we'll see today. It's an anomaly among his church designs, which were typically rooted in English Gothic. This new church for the Dutch Reformed congregation of Fishkill Landing is arguably the first high Victorian Gothic church in North America, and certainly the first Ruscinian one. We see the linearity of the church facade, the colored brick bands, and the colored banding is for its own sake, resisting the form and function espoused by promoters of Northern Gothic. Withers may have felt more comfortable shifting to Italian Gothic from Northern Gothic because of the Reformed Church denomination based in Calvinism. And they did not have cathedrals in Europe, and they were very used to sparse churches. Besides the exterior interaction of two brick colors, the interior is an equal, albeit strange, blending of Northern Gothic, seen in these wooden trusses, with the bold, round arch of Italy, previously unseen in America and done deliberately. In Morningside, the Dutch Reformed Church, we see that Withers recognized the universality of High Victorian Gothic and chooses to view the Hudson Islands not just as Northern Italy, but wherever else in the English-speaking world that this modern architecture is being produced, creating an international style, because some form or color in the building could adapt to any environment it was believed. And indeed, as Ruscanism launched, the British began building this method throughout the empire, from Ireland to India, China to Australia, and it so innately becomes, at this period, an architecture associated with cultural attraction and colonialism. This is the accepted mode of High Victorian Gothic, but there is a second strain Withers introduced simultaneously, one that his colleague Richard Morris Hunt would dramatically advance. This is the High Victorian Gothic referred to as the Continental Picturesque School, whose sources derive from the vernacular medieval architecture of Switzerland, Scandinavia, Germany, and France, the antithesis of Italian Gothic. In 1855, young New Yorkers Joseph Howland and Eliza Woolsey were married and embarked on a lengthy honeymoon across Europe and the Holy Land. In the spring of 1859, after they returned, Howland made purchases of land along the Fishkill Creek with the intention of creating an estate for him and Eliza. In the same weeks that Withers had planned Morningside and the Dutch Reformed Church, he consulted with the Howlands on the design of a main house, a lodge, and a stable to cost nearly $1 million. At its time, it was one of the most expensive houses ever built in the Hudson Valley. It took more than a year to complete, and when finished, Joseph and Eliza were 26 and 25 years old. By rendering their house in this exotic, rare-colored yellow brick, Withers is expressing it as a natural building material prone to wear like lumber. It is not infallible, nor is it meant to be covered with paint, but instead celebrated for its clay heart, its earthy tangibility, and therefore its ability to settle within the landscape because it derives from nature, though not the banks of Hudson. In the gables, we note these bracketed wooden trusses creating pointed arches, a feature common in Pampois, the half-timbered medieval architecture of France that architects would become obsessed with in the next 2 decades. And to the trusses are added these massive Gothic finials, a very Downing-inspired feature along with the house's general asymmetrical balance. To counter this, the floor plan takes after a common symmetrical Georgian floor plan reused in the box in Withers' office, a hall bisecting these plans and entered through a rounded arch. So Tyrone is really a hybrid of Gothic sources from France, England, and Italy, engaging with many other parts of Europe. In the second half of 1861, the Howlands moved into Tyrone and probably began preparations for the Frank Henry Sargent to design the grounds in the garden-esque style rather than the wild English picturesque landscape gardening commonly associated with the Romantic era. Sargent chose this new concept of the garden-esque because it used a mixture of exotic and native plants, again emphasizing the estate's fusion of cultures. Progression of Tyrona's development was violently halted in April 1861 when the U.S. Army vacated Fort Sumter and began its war against the Confederate States of America. Both Withers and the Howlands would participate in the Civil War and were reunited as closing. That year also saw New Englander Richard Morse Hunt, a Paris-trained architect, planning a country house in Newport, Rhode Island for businessman John and A. Griswold. From his time in France, Hunt drew from Pandebois, the half-timbered aesthetic of France, and bright slate found traditionally in Burgundy and Germany. The Griswold house is often branded the first six-style house, a descriptor I use continental picturesque in place of. In the same workspace, Hunt is also creating Ruskinian plans, such as one for the National Academy of Design Architects competition in 1861. A flock of Ruskin fans, the school selected young architect Peter Mark White's design, which is basically a mini version of the Palazzo Ducale, showing the devotion of artists to Ruskin's studies of Venice. Hunt shines as a neoclassical designer in the 1860s as he really does his whole life. But in the early 1860s, he yearns to bring his train into High Victorian Gothic, which is no longer Withers' little design secret in the Hudson Valley. More and more architects have become aware of it by the end of the Civil War. But Hunt's Ruskinian plans continuously fail. They're not selected in competitions, and his interest in the continental picturesque also pauses. But moving towards the end of the decade, Hunt's luck changes when his innovative spin on the style is at last respected. We see the two schools represented here, the somewhat Ruskinian administration building for the Presbyterian Hospital in New York, and in Newport, this business block built for William Travers in the Continental Picturesque School. It's in the Travers block and series of country houses in Newport, none of which survive, that Hunt prepares to bring High Victorian Gothic into the early 1870s in his own mode. So far, we've seen these two schools as separate things developing on their own. From the movement's inception, there was the Italian influence and this Northern European influence that Withers practiced here. They were isolated geographically in Europe, and they had not been joined, except towards the 1860s in one house locally. In 1869, Georgie Harney, who has an office in Newburgh and Cold Spring, designed this lost house, Overdale, in Bombville, for Laura Amelia Fellows, a midlife mother, widow, and aunt of architect Sanford White, who would summer here in the early 1870s. Overdale, from Harney's drawing published in the New York Sketchbook of Architecture, which was edited by H.H. Richardson, is very Ruskinian in its body, with the banding here, the polychroming above the windows, and that really didn't make it into the finished house, but there are these brick courses going across the house. But in the gables, we also see the influence of the Continental Picturesque School and these half-timbered porches on the back. So Harney's drawing from French and German sources in this house and other domestic projects also, these also do not survive, from the late 1860s. And Hunt was sort of colleagues and friends with Harney. We don't know the extent of that, but they were friends by at least 1873 when they went to the World's Fair and began together. Although I do not oppose that Harney is solely responsible for inspiring Hunt to combine our two High Victorian Gothic schools for use in the Howland Circulating Library, or his two other projects with the Howlands built at the same time. These are the ideals Hunt shared in his consideration of the local spirit of the place. As in his Travers block in Newport, Hunt took into consideration the village of Matawan was small and storied like Newport. It had an inclination for rustic design, giving the appearance of half timbering in this room, the cut gable panels and brackets outside, the use of colored slate that drew from nature and connected the mountainous European continent with the Hudson Highlands. Hunt saw classicism was not appropriate here, recognizing the Gothic spirit established. And when he uses a medieval element, such as the corbel table here, it is from Romanesque architecture found in both Italy and Northern Europe. The colored bricks of this building are in reference to the structural polychromy of Rushtonism, but the building is also referencing the pan-European trend in colored brick patterning spread throughout French and German lithographs of the 1850s Hunt had access to in his library. We observe also across this building, and I encourage you to stare at any of the wood in this room, this high degree of carving and how unique every surface is in emulation of the uninhibited medieval craftsmanship that Ruskin championed. Hunt's refined training and brilliant imagination recognized the power of Victorian Gothic, and when he combined its two sides, his architecture was the most dynamic that this country had ever seen. A true modern architecture with themes of materiality, dignity, and unleashed creativity. Most worthy in Hunt's high Victorian Gothic is his consideration of the United States as a hybrid of cultures, that the American landscape and that of our region is not just reminiscent of one place, but the place of many, past and future, and that our architecture should declare that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen Altus. I'd like to now welcome James Rhodes to give his continuing look at Richard Morris Hunt and others. Teresa, can you raise your hand? Where's Teresa? So again, if anybody needs help with transportation, please ask myself or Teresa for help. Ready?
Anytime. Well, I'm gonna try to advance it.
Teresa is here.
Okay, no, I just wanted to point out, Teresa, if anyone needs help with transportation, or ask me as well. James Rowe.
I just want to, okay, sorry, don't put your next. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Good morning.
Good morning. I was hoping to say this earlier, I just welcome everybody into this glorious grand space. I am the president of the board, it's a nonprofit organization here. Happy to be part of this. I'm going to print out a list with directions how to get to where you're going. And I would suggest, we don't have buses. We did not have a real strong head count at the beginning of the week. And what I would recommend is carpooling. It'd be a great opportunity to meet some new, like-minded people, new friends. So all of the locations are pretty close to each other. I don't know who came on a bike, a bus, a train, but hopefully we have enough cars in the neighborhood that we can all just get there at the same time. And there's parking next to the church. And, well, thank you. And this is great. I love listening. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Good morning, James Rhodes. Like any architect, first thing one does when they're in a room is rearrange the furniture. And I'm going to do this, so perhaps I can advance the slides in a different manner than the last presentation. I began thinking about my presentation today concerning Hunt's contribution to the Beacon community. Thinking about the importance of a good client-architect relationship, as he through his wife to the Howland family. I'm again thinking about Hunt's brilliance, talent, and influences on the design profession, thinking about how our built environment reflects who we are as a culture, how our ideals and tastes as a nation evolved between the 19th and 20th centuries, a dynamic area of conflict and change as an independent America addressed the global community. Remember, we were going from Civil War into World War. One would say that's an expansion of our perspective on the planet. I also looked at Hunt's link to me as an architect, a preservation architect with a contemporary purpose. Hunt contributed to the founding of the American Institute of Architects in the 1850s, as we've just been told. I was honored as a fellow of the AIA in the 1990s, so I feel a bit of a connection. In Richard Morris Hunt, I found linkages between all of us here in the 2020s. Here at this vital Center for the Arts at the Howland Center, surviving from the 1870s. Here at the Statue of Liberty in the 1890s, as Victorian eclecticism advanced toward modernism. We heard Steve just mention his perspective on high Victorian style as being something opening up to an international style. I think we will see in Hunt, as I will illustrate, since Hunt was an early student proponent of the Beaux-Arts, the fine arts, as it was becoming what I now call an international style. I've seen it in all of the continents. Here in New York Harbor, I was personally engaged in documenting and preservation of the work of architects Wayne Tilden at Ellis Island and in the rehabilitation of the grandly displayed work of Warren Wetmore at Grand Central Terminal. There are distinct physical and cultural linkages here as well, as I shall illustrate, and lessons in adapting and adopting valuable historic and cultural resources. Let's start by looking at Bedloe's Island. Again, it would be nice if I could make that go, because I got a bunch of transitions. Well, it's not. If necessary, is there a better place for me to stand to do this? Because I've got some not working. You know what I think I will do? I will come there and advance it. And I will just stand among you and use my voice. Oh. Does this work? This will work if I turn it on. Don't do that. Don't point it at the speaker. Hello? Hello. Good. So if I come back here and sit down and get as comfortable as you are. Immigration was the reason for Hunt's involvement at Statue. People were coming here, and a world, as I would say, never stops changing. 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 I'm Mary Post. But what was immigration all about in the 1880s? It was about your past. You were asked, what country are you from? You were asked about your present. What is the condition of your health? There were 29 questions that were asked. I'm only going to give you 3. But it was not an easy task to get in, even then. Your future, do you have a ticket to your final destination? You were required to have $50 in your pocket. And not only to have it, they say, show it to me. You had to prove your worth that you were not going to become a ward of the state. So this is the face of immigration in the 1880s. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore, says Emma Lazarus. I haven't seen that in newspapers lately as being what we're seeking, but there you have it in those days. Along comes Bartholdi, and a lot of people think it was the great gift of France, but it was really Mr. Bartholdi's personal project that brought the statue here. It was not even intended to be here in the first place. His first location was going to be at the Suez Canal. Bertoldi looked all over this country and other locations, and finally settled on getting interest in the statue on the left at an exposition in Paris, and in bringing the torch to Madison Square, because there was no money to build the base. The base cost as much to build as the statue itself. And it was John Pulitzer who finally hired, Richard Morris Hunt to do the base of the statue. Now look at this base. We talked about the high Victorian style. This is not the high Victorian style of Hunt's early work. Look at it, it's well-based, all stone, symmetrical, and recalls European classicism. Here is the Eiffel's structure and the construction finally in New York Harbor of the statue. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Well, I was the architect directing the work for the restoration, the architects and engineers of Ellis Island. I looked all over for a golden door. There was none. I looked for a fancy doorknob that I was going to cast and make it something you'd want to take home, like the Statue of Liberty had the Gagé model. I thought nope, there wasn't any. Because the people who came here were not the wealthy. These are people escaping persecution. Here's a man lifting the eyelid to see if you have a blinding eye disease. He's dressed like a soldier. That's what these people were escaping. And this must have been terrifying to some of the people coming to this country. Here they are lining up in Ellis Island to come in and prove their worth. They entered this room not knowing which door they were going to leave through, the one back home, the one to the United States, or even worse, into the hospital. And they came through from many countries from around the world to Ellis Island, about 12 million people. Somewhere approaching half of this country's residents can trace back to persons coming through Ellis Island. And here's that registry room. You entered one end and you went out the other end. But not the way I found it in the late 1900s. The icy, cold, broken windows, water and mist from New York Harbor collected on the walls, froze, deteriorated the stone. The building was in bad. There were owls, there were rats. That was a pretty miserable place. But we decided not to preserve it per se, but to put it the way the immigrants must have seen it. When many of the rooms they entered didn't even have electric light in space like this. This must have had such a tremendous impression. And my specification writer working on the project said, I want to see it the way my great-grandparents saw it. Well, when Ellis Island was built, you'll see it in the upper left, and I guess there's enough of energy. I pushed the wrong button, what happened? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. How did it jump back there? Okay. The building on the main building is the main register room of Ellis Island. The tiny little building to its left is the surgeon's house. There were people who became ill on the trip, but not so ill that they would be returned. But they also found so many more people coming that they found that they had to expand on that single island. You can see how small the island was. Interestingly enough, they were building subways in New York City, and the spill and the gravel and rock from those subways was hauled out and dumped into the shallows to make more space. And here you can see the islands to the south of the main building with new hospital complex. Interesting that this hospital is given to me to believe that it was the last of the pre-antisepsis campuses of hospital. Today, you can have people ill from various diseases on the same floor of a hospital because you keep them clean and antiseptic. There, you kept illness apart from others by separation in separate buildings. So here's the way we found it. This is the way Frank Lloyd Wright envisioned it. So we did our homework. We looked at the past and the present and the future and just what its potential was. And this is what we concluded was the solution headed by Lee Iacocca. A foundation was formed to raise the money and to honor the immigrants and your ancestry that came through there. Well, again, that's not the way we found it. We found it abandoned, broken down. In fact, it's not much better shape than this today, except the windows have been closed over, and a lot of the vegetation has been brought under control. It's been stabilized. Stabilized in the South Islands does not mean it's useful space. It just means for a short period of time, we'll keep it until some better idea comes along. Here's where the food was prepared for the immigrants, all abandoned in the 1950s. And a piano that will never be played again. What did we have to do? Well, we had some cleaning up to do. We found techniques that to use on the stone using the most gentle means that did its job. We did not sandblast. We did not overly and aggressively do anything to damage. In fact, I preferred, as you'll see in Grand Central, leave a little dirt rather than to etch in and take out too much. So here we use steam. We did use some chemical, but some chemical, we would turn the side of a piece of stone and would work on one side and not the other. So we went through what I called a controlled failure. I would rather control the failure than to make the mistake. Well, if you look at this, we went to every space in this main building and categorized it according to its age, originality, according to its condition, according to its use and significance, and literally did overlays to see what fabric of this building is what I came to call the hard tissue, that which is going to resist change and should be left, and that tissue of the building which is going to be soft to change, like the decay of a tooth. Take out the bad part, but leave the good part. And what we found was around the light court, the wall was in very bad shape, but it was not what you saw from the outside, and we needed to open it up into new gallery space. And where that wall came down, if you look very carefully, there is a black line of wall that runs up and down the corridor. That black wall is what we call the phantom wall. If you really want to reach back into history and understand what survived and what we created, there were some clues. And things like escalators were brought in because of their necessity, but they were expressed in modern terms so they wouldn't be mistaken for something that survived from the origins of the building. We did find in this photograph of something going on in one of the rooms in the west wing of the building. And in a different room, we found a piece of that wood. And we said, you know what we have a chance to do? We can find that we found fans, we found brackets, we found wood, we found benches. We could make this room look like the room for special inquiry. People who had a special problem and were pleading their case to be allowed to remain. And we were able to restore that room. One of the few rooms that we actually went back and recreated the way it had looked historically. We found this photograph. When you got off your boat to go into the main building in Ellis Island, you walked up a ramp from the boat, you walked under shelter. They were watching you very carefully. There were doctors and health officials watching you. And we said, well, you know, we kind of need the same thing. You're going to get off the boat to visit. You're going to want a canopy of your own. But that canopy could not look like the canopy that was taken down historically. It had to look, if you look carefully at it, like, no, that isn't surviving from the 19th century. That's a 20th century canopy, but it is on the identical footprint, the identical outline, the identical spacing of elements, except now it's made of glass. And it is serving contemporary purpose much like the original. But we also found soft tissue to carve out inside the building. The places went through many changes and was in bad condition to put in theaters. We found places, to put in, we found places where the paint peeled off the wall. I had a Swiss Army knife, and I started flicking off paint where I saw something penciled on the wall. Graffiti, many places throughout the building, where people who spent the night or were just bored, and in fact, some were Italian workmen who worked the plaster up, and the plaster is supposed to be allowed to cure a period of time. They wrote on them because they know eventually it was going to be painted over, or they just didn't care. We saved the graffiti and wherever we could find it. Well, we also had to tell the story of the morphological growth of Ellis Island. We found a place to sell Coca-Cola. I mean, you got a job to do here. All in the shadow of the Lady Liberty and the base, the pedestal by Richard Morris Hunt. Well, here's the way we found the building. Notice there are no copper domes on those towers. They had to be recreated using a new technology of the largest spun copper domes ever built, flown in by helicopter, and we were able to take this deteriorating image of Ellis Island and bring it back to be much more presentable and much more like the immigrants would have seen it. So when you see it, you will feel a little more of what your immigrant ancestors must have felt. Well, why is that important? That this building is a classical reminder of Rome and the classical examples of Europe. Well, didn't that really start, didn't that receive its impetus from Richard Morris Hunt himself, who was the first student in the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris? And these architects who are picking up on something different, not the high Victorian, but something new happening to architecture at the turn of the century. Well, I think you can see a parallel here. Warren and Whitmore working with a reed and stem design, much more Victorianized than a lot of the writing I have seen of what at least the exterior of Grand Central Terminal became. I was the preservation project manager for Grand Central Terminal and faced many of the same issues that we did at Ellis Island. Here is the building under construction. You look carefully at old photographs like this, you learn a little more about, you would never think of this as a curtain wall building, but it really is. That stone is not holding up the building is holding up the stone. But it began to deteriorate, and here I am walking on a sidewalk 85 feet over the floor, off the ground with no handrails. figuring out what are we going to do to keep rain and water out of the building. What about Mercury, Hercules, Minerva? Minerva was missing her pen tip. I had to redesign a pen tip. There's a clock by Tiffany. Is there anything wrong with it? Looks pretty good. Well, if you get up close enough, you say, you know, you don't want pieces of mercury falling down to the ground. But which piece? So we had to go over all of these pieces and tap on them with mallets and say, whoa, this one's going to be a problem. So let's do something about that. We saw cracking of the walls inside of Grand Central Terminal. What are we going to do about that? Is it progressing? Why is it cracking in the first place? Those walls, again, look like they're massive blocks of stone. They're not. As you can see there, they're only a couple inches thick, and they're being held up by this structural clay tile. We had to look inside that wall to find out what's pressing against this stuff, these brittle tiles that look like blocks of stone. What's happening that's making them crack? This is a borescope used to get in there, provide light and an image, and we were able to figure what to do. We found in the waiting room, for example, which is south of the main concourse in Grand Central, this cornice with huge chunks out of it where damage had been done in the 50 or 60 years since it was built, and decided we wanted to put them back and restore them. And we would go to a separate area of that cornice and would apply a thick rubber. And then once the rubber was built up, we would put plaster on top of it. The plaster became what we called a mother mold. The rubber would be peeled off and placed within the mother mold so we could cast new plaster, take that new plaster to the big chunk that was missing, and then rebuild and restore that cornice. Over here on the right, I'm working with a conservator to figure out every block what's a slightly different color. Why? Because when you quarry stone, all the stones are not identical. So when they put the tile up, they put it up in such a way that it looked like real stone. In fact, they call it Caen stone. Caen stone from Caen in France was the name of imitation limestone. But we wanted to make sure that we're going to patch it. If we're going to replace pieces that are missing or damaged, we're going to have to get it right. It had been painted. We wanted to get that paint off of there because it was not original, and we found ways of applying different kind of ammoniated rubber, like rubber cement, let it congeal on the stone, and then rip it off, taking the paint, the old deteriorated paint with it, and revealing the natural color of the Caen stone. Went back and did our homework as we did at Ellis Island. We had 12 books of the historic structure report of why Ellis Island looked the way it did and what it became, so we would be able to do responsible work. We did the same kind of research for Grand Central Terminal and found this wonderful photograph. The light streaming in, looking toward the east, you'll notice it isn't the chemical bank, it isn't the Kodak sign. What did those things have to do with improving the environment of Grand Central Terminal? Do you really need to check your stock report out on the floor? Do you need to know about Newsweek? Do you need to know about whiskey? In fact, they got like $500,000 a year from Kodak to have a sign up there. What are you going to do to make up for all that money that Kodak is willing to give you? Because it really does not support a preservation or restoration, or as it more properly is called, rehabilitation of Grand Central Terminal. This is what we imagined it. It is a stair to reflect the stair on the west, a new stair on the east. Well, is that just a wild idea we came up with? Not really. We explored the floors, magnetometers. We went out and found out there was steel in the floor for a new stair that never got built. Why it never got built has a lot to do with the way New York City grew and addressed Grand Central Terminal from the west in a different way than Grand Central itself addressed the tenement buildings to the east. And we also discovered that we needed the east side of the building to work as functionally, viably supportive of the rehabilitation as the one on the west. It took us 1 year to convince the authorities at the state of New York that this piece of new stair, number one, should be slightly different to an educated eye, that it could not have been original. They wouldn't have done it exactly that way. But if you were to look back and forth, you look around, you'd say, well, that's not a sore thumb at all. That actually looks like it fits. It is the footprint of the originally designed stair. Just was not built. So we finally got permission, working with the authorities in Washington, D.C., and the naysayers at the state stopped showing up at meetings, and we got this stair built. We also found wonderful expanses of marble that look like they must be old. Look at that, it's the same marble. That's a ramp that goes down what used to be called the Kitty Kelly entrance, down on the southwest corner of Grand Central. And if you were going to the Oyster Bar, you can see it down at the bottom, or if you're coming in and wondering where you are, you don't have a clue. What is this dark, low-ceiling space? We found out that's not original, and it's really not safe to be lost as soon as you enter a building. So we decided, take out the uniform storage for conductors and employees and open that space up so you can see the skylights, so you can actually see diagonally through into the concourse itself. You'll be safer, you'll have orientation, and it's just better design by going back and reflecting what the original design provided. And this is what we were able to do. And now people walking from the main concourse on the left to the waiting room on the right can look down and see people walking and in reverse. The life of the building is much better revealed. One of the biggest changes and the most important changes of this Beaux-Arts masterpiece was the ceiling itself, which was soiled by, well, actually I took a sample of the paint from the ceiling and sent it to McCrone Laboratories in Chicago. They're the ones that look at the dirt under the fingernails of a corpse and say, we know who killed this person, look at that. They were able to examine that paint, and I said, tell us why the ceiling is like this. The tobacco industry was under attack in those days. And they said, if you can prove that that is smoke from escaping people's lungs, it's going to be well, they couldn't find the signature of any complex molecules. It was sulfur, it was carbon, it was one thing after another. But we couldn't prove it, but I came up with 13 different things, from hot dog steam to the chilled attic because the windows got broken, and any moisture that rose up, or exhaust from automobiles that rose and collected against that and condensed against the ceiling, was something worth getting rid of. So we built railroad tracks on top of the scaffolding we needed anyway. If you look carefully on the right-hand slide, on top of the scaffolding, left and right, are the railroad tracks. We were able to keep the building open. We were talking about scaffolding the whole ceiling. The way the original building was scaffolded was through hundreds of rods stuck through little holes in the ceiling. They're still there, hundreds and hundreds of holes in that ceiling, covered up with little tiny blue discs that you can't, if you look carefully, you'll see them. we didn't want to do a shaky ceiling or to close the building down. And one brilliant scaffold designer said, let's do a bridge between the railroad track, between two new railroad tracks, and we can slide this thing down. And as we move, people will gain interest in what's happening at Grand Central Terminal by seeing the ceiling come to life. So here is the ecliptic of Uranometria, which was the mapping of the heavens that was put against the ceiling as a great mural. There's a whole story, I could talk to you an hour about it, you'd probably be bored to tears, but of why the ceiling is and looks the way it is, and what it became, that you could see the Milky Way. After all that dirt was removed, the Milky Way was under there. If you look from the middle on the right, traveling diagonally up, you see the ecliptic. The ecliptic is the path that the sun and the moon take, the only line through the heavens where you can get eclipses is where the sun and moon coincide. If they're out of register, you don't get eclipses. That's the ecliptic. And you see many of the elements of, you could say, one's horoscope, but it was not intended to be a horoscope. It was just meant to be, by Helieu, the idea was a great sky above a Beaux-Arts interior. And there is Orion. We found over 60 holes in the ceiling with originally little 10-watt Westinghouse light bulbs. And each of those bright areas, which are stars, represents the larger of the stars of each of these constellations. And the way we know how bright they would be is the gold that was painted around each of those holes is some indication of its magnitude. Well, we put in fiber optics, and we're able to use that gold paint as an indication that we don't have to use 10-watt bulbs. We can seal that hole, use fiber optics, and the light will actually reflect the magnitude of those stars. Was that important? Well, when we got done, here you are standing on the balcony, looking across. There was a little girl came with her father. She may have been 10 years old. She turns to her father and she says, "Look, Daddy, stars." I've never felt more successful at doing what I did than to hear that little girl say that. So what is immigration all about? We start out, we see the introduction of classicism. We see the face of America changing. What is preservation all about? What does that have to do with all of this? There I am in front of the Tiffany clock, and then Ellis Island in the middle. Well, immigration asks questions about our past, our character and background. What country are you from? Preservation, you ask, what is the significance and description of that property? Our present, our condition, and integrity. Integrity in preservation terms doesn't mean you're honest. Well, in a way it has to do with honesty. It has to do with ability of an item to tell the truth about itself. Yes, this is authentic. Yes, this means what it looks like. Well, what's the condition of your health, Mr., Ms., child, immigrant? What is the state of good repair? We're going to hear a little bit more about that in just a moment. It's about our future. It's about support and sustainability. You were asked, do you have a ticket to your final destination? We're being asked, do we have a plan? And I think you'll hear in a minute, yes, we do have a plan. So what is preservation all about? It's about the face of our culture. And I think now you begin to see connections that you may not have recognized before. In a world that never stops changing. pass it on. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, James. Before we go on to the next speaker, I just wanted to mention, I introduced some of the board members that were here, but I also want to mention Seth Wiley and Allison Spear, who have arrived, and thank them for their help with this event as well. So again, just to try to keep the schedule, we're going to try to leave here to give you about an hour for lunch. There are many great places on Main Street. Just ask someone if you're not familiar for some suggestions. We're going to try to promptly start at 2 at the Craig House. We're going to, after Jeff Wilkinson's talk on his presentation, we're going to have, we're going to take a mini tour of this building, and I'll let the Howland leaders decide how that works. But that we'll try to end at about 1 so that people have time for lunch. And then for those of you who have bought tickets to the reception, we'll have a reception from 5 to 6 or so, 6:30, I guess, maybe 2 at the DIA. So again, I'd like to now introduce Jeff Wilkinson, architect for the Howland Cultural Center. Thank you, Jeff.
Maybe put the first slide, the next slide up, Stephen. I'm more of a working architect, not strictly an academic. I'm used to yelling. I can yell. I'm more of a working architect. I play guitar. This is the first time I've played in this room without a guitar. But my perspective is really going to be a little more from Hunt as an architect. It's very important that we realize he was one of the first architect trained at, they called Beaux-Arts in France. How did he arrive in France? Well, you have to understand, we'll go to the next slide. Hunt's father was a congressman up in Vermont, Brattleboro. He passed away, one thing leads to the other, and the Hunt family, which was, let's call, fairly well off, ends up living in France. So that's for me important to realize that Hunt wasn't 16-year-old applying to the école in Paris. He actually lived there for many years, spoke French fluent and Italian. Before I get to that, I'll read this paragraph. I've been involved with the Howland Center for many years, and for me, this is one thing that has always been important was this building is a gift, was a gift, has remained a gift. It's never been bought or sold. We're here on a main street where everything has a price tag on it. People are making money back and forth. So there's a spirit here that as a gift, as a cultural center is now a cultural center, formerly a library, I think is very interesting, and it's alive. Granted, the person that gifted it would be what we may have called in the 5% or 1%. But on that note, if you know anybody in that tax bracket, you know, it's only money. We're going to be talking later about preserving this building. Maybe we need $1 million, $1.5 million or $2 million. That's the cost of some apartments. I've done residential wings for that for less. So that's my own, just a little personal take, something about about this space, and I'll go from there. So I wanted to just start out back again with my insights from Hunt more as a working architect, because presumably there are some of those here. One of the most important things Hunt did for architects is created a very important lawsuit. When he was a young man, he had just come back from the École and set up his office on West 10th Street. He got into a very big argument over his construction drawings for a dentist. Now, I've worked for a few dentists, and they can be tough. So I'm just going to read you a little excerpt from the trial, and this comes from his wife, Catherine, who wrote an unpublished biography of Hunt, late 1800s, and this is all from the Library of Congress, that I think a lot of the AIA documents have ended up in the Library of Congress. So this is presumably has told to Catherine over the many years, and Hunt has passed away. They forget the constant anxiety in guarding against errors, or the vexation of redeeming real blunders caused one half the time by ignorant mechanics who don't understand working drawings when they have them, or by learned carpenters who reserve to themselves the right of knocking an architect's best thought into a cocked hat when it suits their convenience. Thoughts that probably took the poor artist days and days to experimentalize upon and mature, but the feeling or meaning of which these practical gentlemen often comprehend about as much as they claim as can be supposed to know of Beethoven's sympathies. Dr. Parmley, this is the dentist, and those who think like him seem to ignore the long years of study and probation which an architect has to go through before he can produce those marks, which seem to come so glibly from his pencil, or to come to a standard that perhaps such folks can recognize more easily. The fortune in actual dollars and cents which he may expend in obtaining the kind of knowledge they so much underrate but cannot do without. Such men will walk into a jeweler's store, ascertain the price of a diamond to be $1,000, and pay down the sum cheerfully and aristocratically without one word of comment. They also understand when they see $1,000 worth of visible, ponderable brickwork that such labor and material mean dollars and cents, but let an architect bring in a bill of $1,000 for 1 year's hard coinage of his brains and nerves, and such art patrons stand against at the imposition. We would like for curiosity to reduce the actual time that Mr. Hunt had individually devoted to this house. They're speaking about a house he built called the Rossiter Residence, a townhouse in New York City. Individually devoted to this house in sketching, drawing, rubbing out, and putting in again in superintendence, contracts, conference arguments, locomotion, letter writing, thinking and plotting day by day and drawing of it by night, it would be fun to reduce all the months so employed into hours and minutes. Then ascertain how many minutes are necessary to draw a tooth, and set Dr. Parmley to see how many dollar teeth he could extract in the same amount of time, hour for hour, and without any counting any other collateral emoluments that may belong to a dentist's profession. Now, no slight here to dentists, and no slight to carpenters. I'll explain later. I just think it's important that the architects here realize that within the founding of the AIA, it really came back to a fundamental decision by, while Hunt wins his case, he wins the right that his drawings were copyrighted. Because what was happening was the client was taking his drawings, rescaling them, rebuilding, or changing quite a bit, and without Hunt's consent. So the trial took 2 years. It's worth looking into. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So we have to remember, I'm sure many of us have been to Paris, this building by Bruce, very famous library, Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève. We'll go to the next slide. So here's the interior. This, I guarantee you, Hunt spent many hours in this library. And what's significant was a combination, was basically the vaulted ceiling. This is a library type. It's the basilica type. We have the Roman arches here. It's actually a shame that these are not lowered, but what's important about this building was the significance of bringing in cast iron into the project. This mezzanine, which is cast iron, you'll see when we walk outside that there's star bolts through the exterior that hold these pieces together. But I think it's, you know, what I remember walking into here first time, it did remind me of the Bibliothèque experience. And, you know, going back to JC's comment, I have a different take of it, but our heads are here, or if we're sitting down, they're down here. And often a practical person would go, well, what's all this stuff here for? And I go, well, that's where the dreams and the imagination have to be. You know, you need that. This housed 2,400 books originally, I'm told. Hunt's personal library, which he brought back from Paris, was 3,000 volumes. It was the single largest, considered the best architectural library in the United States. Next slide, please. Same, I'm just trying to show the type, that this building, from a design perspective, is based, well, we've heard about, you know, more high Victorian, but fundamentally, this building is based on a building type. It's the library, the basilica. Next slide, please. So, in Library of Congress, the original drawings or watercolor sketches exist. Now, this is what we would call part of the esquisse. So if you know about the Beaux-Arts tradition, every month or every 2 months, students were given a problem. You had 12 hours to sketch your answer to that problem. So it trains you to work fast, to think fast, and put it on paper. You hand that in, your basic sketch, and that's your actual answer. Your answer isn't a bunch of checks. Your answer is your drawing. So you learn to think where your composition, everything needs to be on that drawing, because you're not actually allowed to present your answer. You have judges, and they just simply make a mark and say pass or fail. It's brutal. So this I find very interesting. This is, of course, we see quite a significant change to the facade, but it's got all the basic elements. We can go to the next slide, please. The side view. And what's amazing to me is how clear the initial sketch is, the coloring. You know, of course, many things have changed, but to me, it's all there. I'm sure this didn't happen in 12 hours, but my point was that would have been Hunt's training, and there's always a clarity there. Next slide here. That would be the full drawing. In other words, I'll get to this in a minute, but floor plan, front foyer. And it's always interesting drawing as you know, we ended up having to measure this building and to draw it. But basically, we are sitting in a cube. This is basically a cube. What's that? Next slide, please. So we did a little simple thing. Here would be the square, the cube. What's this? Front of the building. It's known as the golden mean. This building is a perfect golden mean. Hence, there's truly a classicism or a classic approach to the layout here. We'll begin talking about other elements. I have to get some water. I have my water bottle over there. Thank you. Okay, we can jump to the next slide. Okay. Right. Next slide, please. So I think what we heard from Stephen and from Jim, both sort of the dialogue that Hunt's having between the picturesque, represented by the Brits across, you know, mainly the Brits across the river. So there's a real dialogue going on between the Vaux, Withers, Downing School. And I see this expressed right here in this elevation where we have, Gothic windows here with round top windows or, true Roman windows. And of course, the basilica windows here, and then the square top windows at the upper part. Prior to doing this building, Hunt was very well traveled. He had spent, I think at the year's late 1860s, traveled throughout Scandinavia, Norway, and certainly throughout Germany. And he, as you saw from the former sketch or the original sketches, it's clear he decides to ramp it up. The front porch, it's time to, it's changing, and part of what I try to introduce in this subject is to just understand that fundamentally Hunt is an artist. While he's a working architect, there's something, he's not designing a building in the Victorian Gothic. He's basically playing with these elements. He's working it out. We from 150 years back, we can put these things into boxes, but they're not. He's in my view, an artist solving problems, trying to shape it. So for me, it's fascinating because it all does kind of work together. I mean, you have these, what they called it, that was known as the Norwegian style, but it's, what we call today as the stick style or the half-timbered pieces becoming a formal element here. And it's balanced, but it's also wrestling, and as Mr. Rhodes points out, truly a classical building. This is fundamentally those things as well. So we'll go to the next slide. So what I thought, those are comments related to the, sort of my views of the design of the building. And now I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing now. I thought this was a good slide because we did the slate roof restoration in, I think, 1999. There was a grant available, and so we were able to, the slate had lasted over 125 years. The life cycle was done. So that's basically, we're talking about building life cycles. We're at 150 years and things are wearing out. So that's great in the sense that it's a fascinating field of study, but I just thought this gives you a nice overview of the organization of the building. You'll notice the lead-coated rolled ridge caps, all the exposed finials, turned by cedar, down here, what's called a cricket. The chimneys are no longer used, except I think for some are for fresh air or some exhaust. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a timber composition at the front portico. Right now, our main focus is the restoration of that because it's clearly at the end of its life cycle. And I showed you the roof plan just to show, just as you to understand all these sloping pitched roofs create a great place for snow to hang out. Snow freezes, thaws, you create ice. It's a dramatic effect, with the angles and the overhangs, but what I want to explain is this porch, did I do something? Oops, okay. Yeah. So this porch actually would have had a wrap around a little balustrade and was intended to be walked out from the large windows. The problem here that we're going to deal is a lot of these timbers are through wall. They're literally inside and outside, and they don't have what we call a thermal break. They basically form the floor and the exposed part of the structure. So our first challenge is going to be surgically taking these out, and the other main problem is all the water that has come from the portico, and we'll see that when we go outside, has come down these large gables and has found its way under the large stone slab, and has basically undermined this large piece of stone. Or we call it removing the fines, where the stone probably was not on a large foundation. It formed the support for the portico. You can go to the next piece. So these are drawings based on research and putting together, the elements of, you can see on the gable ends where mortises had been, and from the old photographs. And this would have been the the more pronounced stick style fretwork that's we've talked about. We keep going at. This is a photo or blow up of the severe deterioration at the front, where water has drifted, ice, water, I'm sure salt and all of that. The next slide. I think these are some details of this lower detail is really a beautiful it's a red vining mortar piece. We've documented that the stone, the original granite foundation was probably quarried up at Breakneck, more than likely. The original brick, we haven't actually defined which brickyard. There's been notes that it came from Croton, which all these river towns had brickyards. Very fine joints here. The brick, black, or this is part of the polychrome, is actually dyed. The cream-colored bricks were through, so they were, that would be the clay color. Next slide, please. And I mean, before on that, going back one is the list of some of the previous slide had various lists of the quarries that would have been used. I think this is a great detailed shot of the arched window, And it just sort of shows the whole panel structure. And going back to, the tradition, I used to, of Hunt as the architect, I used to have this vision of, the Beaux-Arts guys basically just, men's club, cigars, hanging out, Century Club. You do a couple nice watercolor sketches and you phone it in. Actually, from reading through a lot of his other documentation, for instance, the one I just described was the first one I started with, Hunt cites he had done 200 or 300 working drawings for that one project. Beaux-Arts training was rigorous. You had to pass exams on masonry, woodworking, literally had to know these things. Cast iron, very involved in building technology. And because of that one court case early on in his career where he was found that he didn't make certain site visits, he became an actual virtual control freak. Those married to architects, past, present, will understand, that type of mentality. You just can't let it go. So this is another sense. What I enjoy looking at it. So the cream color, they were just called Jersey cream. I'm somewhere in a clay mine or a clay pit in Jersey. They were used. I think I love if you walk around, you'll see the blacks and the creams mixed in the header course. Let's see. I also want to. Here I'm trying to describe a little bit about like that first when I started out with the first part of Hunt's comments. In reading further, he actually had an amazing relationship with his builders. He worked with several for many years. And these buildings typically would have gone to the main general contractor would have been a masonry crew. So most of it would have been run by a local mason, and that's where it would start. And then they would also have like a large furniture or carpentry crew as well. But predominantly it was the mason's call, because this whole thing is what? It's all laid out. And I've seen some, even the drawings for the Statue of Liberty, the base, they're not phoning it in. Every course is detailed. It's very interesting, and it's changed my own perception of what these people did. Also, I want to, we'll go to the next slide, but try that. The other aspect, next slide. Oh, does it work, or is that the last one? Okay, that's fine. It's probably fine. There's just a few other things I wanted to point out about Hunt's world. He was known to Dick by all his friends, so Dickie Hunt. The atelier concept, I think Jim or maybe Stephen had a photograph of Hunt's office. It was a small office, I think literally 4 or 5. You worked in a room, your desks faced one another, and it was truly an atelier. You have to understand at the Cole, you worked for a master architect. You didn't work at the school, you worked in that person's studio. You took your test at the school. So it was really a master builder training program. That's what we're trying to convey here. And it's amazing the people that drifted through Hunt's office. If you know who Frank Furness, really famous architect in Philadelphia, maybe he was known as Frankie, I don't know. Worked for Hunt for years. Sullivan, when he was 6, Louis Sullivan came to Hunt's office when he was 16 begging for a job. Hunt doesn't hire him, And he has to deal with him years later at the Chicago's World's Fair, and another story. A man named Wells worked for Hunt for years. Wells became the founding of the architecture school at Columbia and MIT. There was always a training spirit. Many architects, we all have had interns, and that's going through a whole, reshuffling of, how that works. But I think in all of his writings, there was clearly this idea of this is an atelier. I'm training, I was trained, and I'm training you. And there was that sort of flow that I think was very important to think about. And then the last piece I'll leave is Hunt was an obsessive drawer, or New York drawer, or one of those versions, but everything was about the pencil. And I would say, like if he were here today, here's the computer. The computer's here. This is it. The person could draw. He worked, every project he often worked with a sculptor. So there was really an interesting collaborative spirit. They really did see the arts or the building arts connected, with the whole team. So I'll leave that. I think that's the end of my talk. Thank you so much.
So, thank you, Jeff Wilkinson. Really grateful for your talk, for James Rhodes' talk, and for Stephen Balsas' talk today. Before we move on to the tour, I just want to, again, remind everyone of who made today possible. So again, I'm just going to repeat the organizations and that really helped us with today's events. So, as I said earlier, I'd like to thank Ober Creek Farm, Homespun Foods, Dia Beacon, the Craig House Management, Dutch Reformed Church Management, Howland Public Library, Beacon Historical Society, and of course, the Howland Cultural Center. So, I think right now I'd like to know if Teresa Kraft, the president of the board, do you have a suggestion on, or Jeff Wilkinson, do you feel that you're able to sort of lead a tour of everyone here, or would you like to split it up and maybe Teresa and Craig Wolf can maybe do the inside while you do the outside and then we split in 10 minutes? Or would you like to just try to lead everyone outside for a few minutes?
I think that there's a lot of people maybe if anybody wants to take a tour, I'll just start out in the front and maybe walk around the east side, or maybe the west side, or the east side, and then just, answer questions or,
Jeff, why don't you point out some things inside first, while we're all in here?
that's a bookcase. Well, there's a staircase. Yeah, there's actually another staircase in here. These are, that space. What's actually fascinating is there's a great apartment upstairs. You have to understand, this was there's an incredible apartment. I thought you could get $3,000 a month for it. But upstairs, the library, this was designed so that the librarian lived upstairs. And I don't think we'll be able to go up there. Nothing would be ADA or, that's vertical challenge. But I love the idea of chamfering. I've always been a big fan. Hold on one second, please. Can you? So one of the carpentry techniques I think is really great is just this simple newel post. It's just a very simple, you didn't have to turn it on a lathe. It just comes up and meets. These interior columns, they are not, it's the same idea, they're a chamfered piece. It's still a classical piece, you know, it's a very simple, like, as we were looking at those Italian buildings, that's what it reminds me of. It's, you know, a lot of it is stonework composed or reapplied to wood. It is cruel to, as we walk outside, that these cast iron pieces, and you know, I really feel like when I show you the photos of Saint Genevieve, that there was an intended mix of metal here. You know, like the grills in the windows are trying to bring that into the space. You know, there's a lot of wood in this, but there was also intention to mix metal. It was designed as a library. There's actually literally cork there's a layer of cork in these floors to keep it quiet. And I think that's in general. I mean, a lot of the details are that you see with the doors. You would see that in Sweden, you know, with that type of arrangement of the panels in the doors. You know, these are things that do remind that he's bringing from that tradition. Anything else? That's all I can think. I think time-wise, I'd rather just work outside.
Why don't we all head out?
Yes.
These doors right here, if you look at them,
Ah,
it's an open book.
yes. The panel, yeah, the linen press door, yes, this carved book. That's a good point.
So again, thanks everyone for coming. Please join us at 2 o'clock at the Craig House, which is 7, I believe it's 7. I believe so. I believe the person will, or they know we're coming at 2. I don't know how much before 2 you can drive in, but they're expecting us, the Craig House. And so please join us there promptly at 2. Have a great lunch, but let's do the tour with Jeff, please, outside, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.